Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the Van Andel Institute. Hello. I'm glad to see that you all have so much energy this morning. Like I said, good morning. Welcome to the Van Andel Institute and to Faculty Learning Day 2013. For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Jeremy Osborne, and I'm the director of the Center for Teaching Excellence at GRCC. So I've met several of you already, and those of you that I haven't met, I'm sure that your inbox and your email is well acquainted with me by this point at least. So we have an excellent program today, and I'm glad that you all could make it out this morning. Before we get started, I have several guests in the audience that I'd like to acknowledge. First of all, we have the president of GRCC, Dr. Stephen Ender. We also have the chairman of the Board of Trustees, Richard Verberg, as well as Trustee Richard Reiskamp and Trustee Richard Stewart. We also have several guests from outside of GRCC. Chad Gano, the provost from Aquinas College, and Carrie Dudkevich from Davenport. Carrie. One of the things that I've noticed in the short time that I've been here, because I am fairly new to GRCC, is in the conversations that I've had with people, one of the common themes is the excellence of the faculty here and the passion that all of you bring to teaching and your commitment to students. And one of the major goals that we have at the college is fostering student success. And you all are the biggest reason that we excel and are a college of distinction when it comes to doing that. And the reason that I wanted to bring that up this morning is Faculty Learning Day really is one of the few opportunities that we get each year to get all of you together in one place to really celebrate great teaching. And I know that you spend a lot of time in your disciplines and your departments, and it's just great to be able to get everyone into one place, into one room, and to really be able to collaborate together and to learn together and to have dialogue together around topics that are important to all of us and that affect our ability to deliver effective instruction and to foster student success. So it's really encouraging to me to see all of you in one place. This year, the discussion and collaboration that we're going to have today is all about the broad topic of accessibility, as you know. And one of the reasons that I'm very excited about what's happening today is because this does tie in directly to that passion that we all have for student success. As a group, I know that you care deeply about student success and about your students and are willing to go the extra mile to help them achieve their goals. And really, accessibility at its core is all about fostering success for all students. And that's something that does, to go along with the theme today, often involve a combination of some art and some science. So we will be focusing on innovation today and creativity and technology and really how we can create an accessible campus for all learners. On that note, we do have several sessions today that are covering different topics related to that. So we will be talking about technology, we'll be talking about universal design, we'll be talking about learning styles, and sort of approaching accessibility from a lot of different directions. Introducing our keynote today will be one of the teachers that embodies that commitment to students. And it's hard to imagine that there's anyone in the room that is more integrated into the GRCC community than the person that I'm about to introduce. She has been a part of the GRCC family for 27 years, the last 13 years of that as a professor of education, and most recently was the 2012-2013 faculty recipient of the Excellence in Education Award. So, please join me in welcoming Diane Sparks.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that I had a chance to prepare this time. I'm not going to have a heart attack on stage, so we're all good. I was kind of approached before Christmas break to cover a couple of little topics. One that what professional development has meant to me as a teacher, and then also my privilege to introduce our keynote for today. So I'm going to kind of wend my way toward that introduction. Again, welcome. I don't know about you, but I know I was one of those geeks. I liked school starting, and I liked to go back, and I liked to get all the new clothes. That was my thing. So I like learning days, I admit it. So I just wanted to welcome everybody. This is a topic around which I think we all feel sometimes like we haven't provided what we needed to provide, and I'm really excited to learn some new things. So when I was asked to think about my beliefs about the role of professional development in quality learning, lots of things occurred to me, as they do. I tend to be a fairly nonlinear thinker. So the first was really a profound thankfulness that I've had the chance to work for an organization whose beliefs align so closely with mine about the need for lifelong learning. I don't know where I'd be if I didn't keep learning. Well, I do know where I'd be, and it wasn't a pretty scenario. So the fact that I've worked with ages birth through, well, my oldest student I think has been 65, gives me kind of a special insight, I think, into the idea that working with students of any age, teachers benefit from being on the other side of that learning equation. The fact that I've had so many opportunities to extend and expand my learning, my knowledge, and be a learner on a fairly consistent basis has been a real source of personal and professional growth, as well as sometimes a very humbling experience. My next thought was that I have been really lucky. I've had so many opportunities to see how others live and learn and teach. I've seen cutting-edge preschool programs in Reggio Emilia, Italy. I've attended a great Blackboard conference in Las Vegas, and what happened there will stay there. I've learned from the directress of an orphanage in Budapest, Hungary, whose children's outcomes are positively influenced while in Belfast, Ireland. And I've attended a conference in Boston, on brain development, presented primarily by neurosurgeons. That was a challenge. Mark Twain said, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, and charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime." So that has given me the opportunity to broaden my perspective. Another thought was the influence of continued learning on my life's work. Over the time I've been in the field of early childhood, I've changed dramatically as a professional. I believe that change is a result primarily of the experiences and learning that I've acquired over 30 plus, oh, that hurts, years in the field. I went from working at a job to building a career to nurturing a passion. The more I learned, the more passionate I became and continue to become about my field. The more everyone learns, the more passionate they become about what they do. So yes, I think professional development is necessary. It is important to being a professional and a passionate teacher as engaged students. My final thought came to me last night when I woke up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night. I want you to take a minute, think back to undergrad, and those huge lecture halls looked a lot like this. And there was one little TA in the front who was really only about a year older than you, but they thought they knew everything. Never once did they give you any eye contact, okay? So those 400 students are all looking down at this TA, and the TA was completely sure that he knew all the material that he had to cover. What I've learned is that the longer you're up here teaching, the more you know how much you really don't know and really want to learn. So, it's my privilege to be able to introduce to you our keynote speaker for Learning Day 2013. Irene Bowen, JD, is president of ADA One LLC, a consulting firm that provides ADA consulting, speaking, and mediation services to public and private entities for Title II and III of ADA, as well as assistance with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and other disabilities rights laws. This may sound vaguely familiar, Irene. You had it on your website. Yeah, it summed it up. In her 30 years experience as a disability rights attorney, she became known for her depth and breadth of knowledge and has a strong reputation as knowledgeable, insightful, and a visionary leader, attorney, and speaker. In 2008, Ms. Bowen left the Department of Justice, where she'd been Deputy Chief of Disability Rights Section overseeing ADA enforcement. She was actively involved in the development of ADA, the original ADA accessibility guidelines, Department of Justice's existing and proposed regulations. She established the Disability Unit in the Civil Rights Division, the department's program for certifying state and local accessibility laws and codes, the first ADA investigation procedures, and the use of mediation as a means of resolving litigation. She was responsible for co-founding the National Center for Law and Deafness as a law student. In her bio, she includes her philosophy, so I'm going to read to you what she says because I think it has bearing on what we come here to learn about today. She's developed her career, devoted her career, to her passion. Access for people with disabilities to facilities and services under the laws that guarantee their civil rights. At the same time, she's practical about the challenges of compliance. And if you had been in the preschool when we got ADA compliance written up, you would have been proud of me to say she didn't go off the deep end, because in an old church, there wasn't a lot of ADA compliance, and we had to work really closely with the people who had the power to change that. She believes that most covered entities want to comply with the laws, but most want to do what's right and implement best practices, even those that aren't necessarily required for compliance. But compliance can be complicated. Oh, yes. Civil rights cross into code territory when inaccessible facilities impede access. For almost always, satisfying the law means more than one law and more than one federal, state, or local standard. The civil rights obligations are limited by factors related to cost and difficulty. The code requirements generally aren't. Ms. Bowen has made a second professional passion teaching. She uses her teacher training and skills to make legal principles clear to those who aren't lawyers, as well as those who are. She knows the details of equal opportunity and of accessibility. Requirements can be overwhelming to novice, but is able to engage individuals and groups in interactive and even fun learning experiences. The sign of a good teacher. They learn what they need to and learn how to learn more. She pushes you to not just do the minimum that you can get away with under the law, and helps you to understand the principles behind the laws and benefits of compliance. She urges you to provide access in a way that works for you and your unique situation, uses your resources wisely, and improves services for everyone. Finally, Ms. Bowen has spearheaded the department's ongoing higher education initiative. She oversaw comprehensive reviews of the campus access agreements with University of Chicago, Swarthmore College, Colorado College, and EDMC's Brown Mackie colleges. She also supervised DOJ cases involving NCAA and the Southeastern Conference concerning academic eligibility rules for student athletes with disabilities. It's clear that Ms. Bowen possesses both the knowledge and passion needed to help us support the needs of all of our students and provide a fully accessible campus for everyone. Please welcome Irene Bowen.
Good morning. There are a lot of you. I apologize in a way that this will not be interactive, as was just mentioned, is what I like to do. You probably don't expect it will be too much fun, but I'll try to make it as enjoyable and enlightening as possible. I'm wondering if I can, if I close this, will that still be up there, I hope? I think so, because I have my notebook. Let me just get arranged here for a minute. Need plenty of water because I am having the winter crud like so many of you, recovering from it. Okay, there we go. I've been here now, I think, for 36, 38 hours, and I've enjoyed it. I got a tour of the city by car, which was lovely, and I've gotten to know a number of you. And one of the things that has really struck me is what's already been mentioned, that you really do care about your students. There's a huge amount of subject matter expertise here. You're proud of your college, and it appears to me that you're always wanting to know what more you can do for your students and to help them have success, as Jeremy has mentioned. And we're going to talk today about various rights and responsibilities of those who are involved in the process, and then there are the breakout sessions later today that will go into more of that. So the topic is yours, ours, and theirs. And by that I mean, by yours, I mean you as individual faculty members. By ours, I mean the institution, the college as a whole. And by theirs, to me, it's sort of off-putting that people talk about people with disabilities as they. And sometimes you can't help that. But I think it reflects the fact that we often think of people with disabilities as the other. You know, they're not like us, they're different, and they have been treated in that way historically. The ADA changed that in many ways that we will discuss today. It's so broad and wide-ranging and very clear in its prohibitions against discrimination. But it is sometimes unclear who's responsible for what, and I know that that's one of the concerns of the faculty here, especially because of the agreement that you're under with the Department of Education. For a minute, I want to talk about yours and ours in a little bit different way. I grew up in the South and the Midwest. I was born in Mississippi. I know you can't tell, but once in a while when I say things like, I used to could do that, and I can't now, you can tell. But you hear people say y'all a lot, and y'all can be singular or plural. So if you want to make sure it's plural, it's all y'all. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is what y'all are responsible for as individual faculty members, and then what all y'all are responsible for as the college. And of course, as an individual faculty member, you're part of the college and you have responsibilities to the college. And then there are also the institutional responsibilities, and that's the all y'all part. So I know that you are under a compliance agreement, and that's the all y'all, that's the institution is under compliance agreement with the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education as a result of complaints. But that agreement places responsibility on the college. You as individuals have responsibilities to carry out the college's policies and practices. And of course, the all y'all part, the college has to set those policies and practices and make them clear to you. But the problem is that one of y'all can put all y'all out of compliance. Not necessarily by intending to, but by taking actions that go contrary to the college's established policies and procedures or the ADA. And we're going to talk today about how it's best not to do that, both for you as y'all, an individual, and for the college, the all y'all, as a whole. I know that some of you, I know you all have to be here today. I know that it's sometimes with all the compliance responsibilities and the teaching responsibilities that you have, it may be easy to think, oh, it's just another law, it's just another requirement, it doesn't have anything to do with teaching. The ADA has a lot to do with teaching, and yes, it is another requirement that we hope eventually will be sort of the fabric of the college, that you do think about it when it's appropriate to do that. And I hope that you will try today to sort of put that part of what you might be feeling aside and to think about the mission and the values of the college. I was looking at the strategic plan, which I think is just great, and the values that it lists correlate very clearly to much of what the ADA is all about, because it is about success for students. The values include diversity, an inclusive learning and working environment, responsiveness, anticipating and addressing needs of students, innovation, and you will need to play around with some innovative techniques, especially when you're thinking about access to the web, access to learning platforms, instructional materials, online learning, alternate formats of documents. All that does take some creativity and innovation. And respect. We treat others with courtesy, consideration, civility, and we take personal responsibility. So I hope that you'll keep those in mind and think about how those and what you do on a daily basis as you teach, how those are all tied in with the ADA. And then there's me. I'm not up there, but the yours, ours, and theirs. But I did want to tell you a little bit about me. There was quite a bit in that introduction. Thank you. I'd forgotten that all that was there. But I have both my students and both my children and I, the three of us graduated from state universities. We told our kids they could go to a state school for 4 years or a private school for 2. They both chose to go to state schools for 5.5 years. They were on that plan, but they did it. One of them, they both were identified as having disabilities. My son has ADD, which he's managed. He didn't want to take drugs because it made him less creative, and he didn't want any accommodations. Our daughter has several invisible disabilities that have been pretty disabling at times. She had severe asthma and uncontrollable asthma and severe allergies for a while. And when she went to the University of Florida, they were very accommodating to her. Nonetheless, because of fibromyalgia and narcolepsy, which had only recently been diagnosed, she slept through her finals, literally. That was partly because of the medication she was taking. And she was able to do a medical withdrawal the last day of the semester. I was such a grateful parent. She took a semester off, went back, and succeeded. Is doing very well, and I think they're both planning now to get their masters. So I've been through the experience of dealing with students who you care about and helping them succeed. My daughter had a 504 plan, and the University of Florida, as I said, was just very, very supportive, so I appreciate those who do support students who struggle because of those reasons and help them achieve success. That's not working. Am I pointing the wrong thing? All right. Am I doing something wrong? Am I pointing at the wrong thing? Go ahead and try that button. Okay, thank you. This is just an overview of the topics we're going to hit today. Who are they? Who are people with disabilities? A little bit of ADA 101, but the basic requirements are. But we're going to focus more on what you don't know can hurt you, like what can be the consequences of what you don't know or what you do or what you don't do. Some recent developments, particularly in the area of electronic communication. It takes a campus. This is what you all have to do together. It's not just academic. I'll touch on some things that may not seem central to learning, but do affect students with disabilities in the classroom and elsewhere, like service animals, segues, et cetera. And then we'll focus on what faculty responsibilities in this world of the ADA are. Caution, this is my disclaimer. To put it simply, I'm not a lawyer. I used to be. I'm a recovering lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. This is not legal advice. You have a lawyer who's wonderful. Turn to your legal office for specific advice about what you're required to do and what happens if you don't. But I will give you an overview about that. So who are they? Who are individuals with disabilities? And I'm going to talk a bit about people with disabilities generally, and then specifically students with disabilities. People with disabilities are the largest minority group in the country. They are 19% of the population, which is larger than Hispanics, which are 18%, the next largest group. And it's a minority that includes all minorities. In that way, it's different from other minority groups. 57 million people have a disability. And it's probably even more than this, because the definition for this from the National Institute of Mental Health and from the Census Bureau, which is what this is from, was based on what people report. And of course, there are people who aren't diagnosed or who don't want to report or don't consider themselves to have a disability. But it's a very large number. And most of these disabilities are invisible. We think of people with disabilities as being those who are in a wheelchair or a scooter or deaf or blind. I think that's sort of the traditional concept. But in fact, most people have disabilities that you don't recognize when you just see the individual, such as hearing disabilities, low vision, HIV and AIDS, bipolar disorder, fibromyalgia, arthritis is not always easily obvious, diabetes, traumatic brain injury. So most 10% of the disabilities are people who have disabilities, have mobility disabilities, which doesn't necessarily mean they use a mobility aid, but they have trouble standing or walking compared to the average population. Almost 6% have a serious mental illness, and that number doubles at the college level. The next most predominant is difficulty seeing and then difficulty hearing. The number is growing, and in fact, at least half of us are personally affected. When President Obama celebrated the 20th anniversary of the ADA, which was 2 years ago, he said that each of us has, will have, or loves someone who has or will have a disability. And I think he meant by who you love, like your family. So if you assume that we all love everybody in our family, and you think about it, it's probably true. That you may have a family member with a disability, or as you age, or they age, or as they experience life, because most disabilities are acquired, they may experience a disability. The population is aging. Somebody recently said that we're getting older. It's very popular. Everybody's doing it. And that's something that I think we all hope to continue to do. And as you get older, you acquire limitations, especially in hearing, vision, mobility, etc. People are surviving traumatic brain injury and other conditions that they would not have survived before. So for all these reasons, the portion of the population is getting larger every year. Students with disabilities, about 10% of the post-secondary population, and again, GAO, who did this study, thinks that the number is higher because of that people don't reveal their disability because of stigma, or maybe they don't even know that they have one and haven't been diagnosed. But the largest part of this population is learning disabilities, which I think when we think about education, that's the disability that will most likely come to mind, because it affects learning, which is what all this is about. So about more than 9% of students also experience clinical depression at some point in college. And we know that depression may not be obvious, but will affect the learning process as well. Other conditions of students with disabilities are health conditions, mobility, intellectual disabilities, the new name for what we used to call mental retardation, autism, speech disabilities, etc. The young man, I throw in pictures of people with disabilities because I think they sort of illustrate the goals we're going for here. The young man in the top right here is a student at a community college, I think it's in the Midwest, who has prosthetic legs and a prosthetic hand, and he plays on his basketball team with others who don't have disabilities, at least disabilities that we can see. This is in the bottom right is a couple who appear to have intellectual disabilities and maybe getting married, or at least appear to be romantically involved. And then this is a man using a keyboard device, which is, I believe, connected to his phone line, but he's using some form of the relay service because of a speech or hearing disability. Another change, veterans are returning. They have educational benefits now, and many of them, of course, are going to have disabilities. The the disability that's predominant among vets is hearing disabilities because of IEDs and other noises that they've been exposed to. But they also have PTSD, traumatic brain injury, mobility disability, disfiguring burns, all of which are considered disabilities. So how do these statistics, here's some more statistics about how this impacts people. The unemployment rate is twice as high for people with disabilities as the rest of the population. And the rate at which they live in continuous poverty is more than twice as high. And this is my opinion more than anything else, but I think it's supported. No discrete population benefits more from higher ed than people with disabilities. There's more potential for them to improve their lot in life, their achievement, et cetera, by attending a college or university. Okay, ADA 101. Just want to give you a little bit of background of why is there an ADA and what does it mean? This is my favorite historical photo of ADA history. Senator Harkin from Iowa was one of the prime sponsors of the act, and he said that the ADA is nothing less than an emancipation proclamation for people with disabilities. This photo is of a protest, I think, in New Jersey about inaccessible public transit. At the time of when people were advocating for the ADA, buses were not accessible. Very few buses in the country for public transit were. So when you look at this sign that says, I can't even get to the back of the bus, what does that trigger? What association might you make with that? Rosa Parks, right. And in fact, I saw the skating rink for Rosa Parks and other things yesterday where you honor her. She was not allowed to sit in the front of the bus, but people with disabilities couldn't even get on the bus at the time. And they were, of course, limited in other ways, voting, reading their electrical bill, going to college, getting accommodations, et cetera. So for all these reasons, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which basically bans discrimination in all activities of state and local governments and most private entities, those that are considered public accommodations. It builds on Section 504, which you may also be familiar with, which banned discrimination only in activities that got federal financial assistance. Well, state colleges and universities were among that group, so I think higher ed has been one of the innovators. It seems like things always happen in higher ed first, or that you're sort of the cutting edge of developments in society. So this really isn't new to most colleges and universities. It's just that the coverage is broader. Things that are covered, everything you do. We're going to focus on the classroom, academic modifications, effective communication, et cetera, and the web and electronic communication. But it also covers everything you do. Meetings, we have an interpreter here for a faculty member today. Meetings are covered, graduation is covered, counseling, other kinds of activities. This is athletics are covered. Again, this is a photo of an athlete. This champion, NCAA wrestling champion, is an above-the-knee amputee, both legs. And he was the mainstream NCAA wrestling champion a year ago. The ADA is 22 years old, but there are a number of things that are causing us to pay more attention to it. Compliance agreements are more frequent. Don't feel alone. The Department of Education and Justice have both stepped up their compliance efforts, especially in the last 6 years, I'd say, and even more in the last 2 or 3. The ADA Amendments Act clarified that the definition is very broad, to be broadly applied, and that was in 2008. There are new regulations from the Department of Justice, and there will be more. And technology, as we've mentioned and as we all know, is expanding so rapidly that that's one of the areas where the government is applying its enforcement efforts. You also have more demand because you have more students with disabilities, and we know that you have fewer resources as time goes on, it seems. There's more private litigation, and at the same time, while you have fewer resources, there are heightened expectations on the part of students. What you don't know can hurt you. There are laws and there are consequences for not complying with those laws. So let's look at what those might be. I've already mentioned that Title II is an expansion of Section 504. The Department of Education has regulations under 504. The Department of Justice has the regulations under the ADA. The college has a duty to comply, but as I mentioned, you can take the college out of compliance by your individual actions, whether you're faculty, it might be one of your teaching assistants in your classroom, somebody administering exams, it might be a work-study student, or you may have other students who create a hostile environment, and in that case, you have a responsibility to report or take action about that immediately. I don't want to get too much into the legal details, but I just want to give you sort of a background as to how the law is structured. It covers individuals with disabilities, which means someone who has an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And all those terms of art are broadly construed. You may also just have a record of an impairment, such as a record of mental illness, even though you don't have it now, or you may be regarded as having an impairment. And in some cases, those will also be disabilities. Examples of major life activities. I mentioned that most people think of walking or talking or hearing or seeing as major life activities, and they are. And if you're substantially impaired with respect to one of those, you're definitely a person with a disability. But there are a number of activities you might not think of as major life activities or ones that can be impaired. And the ones that are in italics are ones that have been added to the regulations that affect employment and will also affect you by EEOC or by the 2008 amendments. Concentrating, functions of the immune system, normal cell growth. That means that cancer, which impairs normal cell growth, is a disability. And now there's a list of those conditions that are almost always disabilities. And one of the things that I think is interesting here is that it's now very clear that HIV/AIDS is a disability. Diabetes almost always is. Bipolar disorder, epilepsy, autism. And by almost always, what the government is saying is you don't really need to even think much about whether a person who presents with this kind of impairment has a disability. Of course, learning disabilities are going to be ones that are going to be significant to you. And I hope you all know that having a learning disability has nothing to do with intellect. It may affect achievement if a person doesn't get the right kind of accommodations, the ones that work for them. But the brain is sort of wired differently. People learn in different ways, process information in different ways if they have learning disabilities. And here is a list of a few people who have them, and it will be clear that it has nothing to do with intellect. Albert Einstein, Walt Disney, General Patton, Nelson Rockefeller, Kinko, the guy who started Kinko's, couldn't read. People gave up on him. And John Irving, the prolific novelist who didn't know he had a learning disability until his kid was diagnosed with it. And he said, oh, not everyone reads like that? Which he read the same way that his son did. So many bright people have learning disabilities, and many successful people have learning disabilities. A qualified individual, I just wanted to put this up to let you know that there are limitations, that we're not, it's not like I have a disability, I get this. I want you to change the requirements for the course, or I want you to, exempt me from having to do something. In some cases, that might be required. It all depends on the situation. You start with the analysis of whether the person has a disability, whether they're qualified, and then what is a reasonable modification. That's something that Disability Student Services does, so that they determine whether the person has a disability. I just wanted you to know sort of what goes into that analysis. And the major things, the major parts of the ADA that affect what we're talking about today are one of the maybe 10 principles that underlie it. One, the big one is equal opportunity. That's what this is about. It's a civil rights law, just as Title IX and Title VI are, and it's based on equal opportunity and reasonable modifications to policies and practices. And then the third one is effective communication, which requires that you ensure that communication with people with hearing, vision, or speech disabilities is effective. In fact, it has to be as effective as communication with others. Now, most civil rights laws are based on the premise that you treat people the same. You give a woman the same opportunities, access, et cetera, as a man, and vice versa under Title IX. You treat people of different races and national origins the same as others under Title VI. But one way in which the ADA is different from other civil rights acts is that it will often require that you do something different for a person with a disability. That's why you make accommodations. You do something different to give them the same opportunity. You don't guarantee success necessarily, but you give them the opportunity for success. It's often called leveling the playing field. And as an example, if we had said to someone who had to participate here today and they had a hearing disability, sent a visual notice that you're supposed to come, and they came here and there wasn't an interpreter, and that's the accommodation that works for them, this would be meaningless to them except for the PowerPoint slides. That's an example of taking an extra step in order to provide equal opportunity. Another example of how this relates to effective communication, my PowerPoint is accessible to a person with a vision disability. And I was actually kind of cowed by doing PowerPoints because I had somebody do those for me when I was at Justice, so I had to learn how to do them and then how to make them accessible. And with some suggestions by people who know more than I do, I've learned how to do it, and I think you will all be experiencing this as well. For example, I use contrast, either white on dark or dark on white. The font is never less than 24, and it's usually more than that. Color is never used to convey meaning. And the reason that these things are done is that people who have learning disabilities or who have vision disabilities will use software that will sort of scan the document and read to them aloud, or it will read a Word document. So the PowerPoint has, all the words are in the outline version of the PowerPoint, and I've put picture descriptions in, very easy. It's a couple of right clicks and you write a description, and a screen reader will pick those up as well. Otherwise, a person who's blind is not going to be able to understand any of the pictures. And then there are a few other things, but that's basically how you make a PowerPoint accessible. There are limitations. You don't have to do anything that's a fundamental alteration to your program, your class, your course. You don't have to do anything that's an undue financial or administrative burden as far as communication. So I've talked about PowerPoints. How else might the electronic communication or technology be impacted by the ADA? In lots of ways. and you're using technology more and more. The classroom has changed incredibly, especially over the last decade. There is nothing in the ADA that mentions the web or technology, and the regulations don't say anything about the web or technology. But the government has been very clear that those are means of communication, and they're subject to the effective communication requirements. So through enforcement and guidance and other means, the government has made very clear what the expectations are, and that is that if you use some means of technology, of electronic communication, it has to be accessible to those who need that access. And we'll talk about some specific applications of that in a minute in some cases. But we're talking about clickers, computer stations, PowerPoints, audio. Audio should be captioned for people who can't hear. Video. Video, at times you may need to have a narration of what is in the pictures that a blind person can't see, because just hearing the words that everyone else hears don't necessarily convey the meaning. Online services, course registration, library, kiosks, all this is affected by the ADA's requirements for communication. So how do you overcome barriers on a website or in your instructional materials, Blackboard, et cetera? I've talked about how there's screen reader software. JAWS is one of those technologies. Software that converts text to speech. Accessible navigation, accessible clues about how to go where on a website. Pictures that are tagged. I mentioned how the photo descriptions, or that are narrated. There may be, in some cases, you can click and get an audio description of a picture on a PowerPoint or on a website. And then other sources of information. If the web page is not totally accessible yet, sometimes you can give someone an 800 number so that they can call and get the same information. Right now, there aren't, as I mentioned, there aren't any specific regulations about what's required. But there are some industry standards, which are the W3C guidelines. And the federal government has been subject to website accessibility requirements for years now by law. Surprise, it applied it all to itself. Doesn't always happen. And Section 508 is the part of the statute that applies to them, and there are some very clear and the guidelines that get updated. And I understand those are what the college is following currently, at least under the compliance agreement. And there apparently is going to be rulemaking very soon about this from the Department of Justice. So federal enforcement. Your compliance agreement is with OCR, Officer of Civil Rights at the Department of Education. They have the authority to do administrative enforcement. If they get a complaint, they can investigate it. They do a lot of early complaint resolution now, where they ask both sides if they'll mediate and try to get it over with without a finding. Or if that doesn't work, they can do a letter of finding a violation or not of a violation. And then they can do a letter agreement or a compliance agreement, which is you're under a resolution agreement with OCR. If that doesn't work, the regulations require them to try early and often to settle through all these means. If that doesn't work, they can withhold federal funds after an administrative hearing. That doesn't happen very often. They've threatened to do it, but somehow that suddenly got compliance, which it should. Or they can refer a matter to the Department of Justice, and then DOJ litigates on their behalf. That has happened once with the ADA, and it was here in your state, with respect to the University of Michigan, the big house, the stadium. Justice now, as of a year and a half ago, can investigate state and local colleges and universities on its own. Those complaints don't have to go to education now. So Justice can do that on its own. It can also do compliance reviews, as can the Department of Education. And there are times when the Department of Justice will get a complaint about one little thing, and they can end up investigating the entire college or the campus through a compliance review if there's some indication that there is a problem. They also can enter into settlement agreements that are enforceable in court. They can litigate if they get a referral from education or independently, and they can get damages for individuals and injunctive relief, which is an order that something be done. So here's the big house. The issue here was alterations had been done to the stadium without providing accessible seating. Seats had been taken out and put back. And there was a private lawsuit, and this is how things often happen. There was a private lawsuit that couldn't be resolved amicably. The complainants went to the Department of Education, which did an investigation. The Department of Education sent a 10-day letter which says, you have 10 days to fix this. And surprisingly, it only took them 20 days, I think, not much longer than 10, to then take action, which was that education referred it to justice, and justice pretty quickly joined the litigation. And that's how the consent decree came to be. And for, I think, a year, the big house was not the biggest stadium in the country because they had to provide accessibility, had to close down certain sections while they fixed it. But now they're back. They're back to the big house. Other types of settlements, just so you get an idea of what the implications are here. At McNeese University in Louisiana, a woman who was a student wanted to use the restroom at the student union. It said it was accessible. She used a wheelchair. It wasn't accessible. She couldn't open the door as she left. She fell. She had to have surgery. She asked that they fix the door. They didn't. They had done very little on the campus. She sued. The case went up and down in the courts, all appeal levels. The university kept losing. And at some point, the Department of Justice became involved and did a compliance review of the entire university, and resulted in not only the campus spending, I think, $8 million in capital improvements for increased accessibility, but the whole Louisiana State University system was directed by justice. They agreed to evaluate all their campuses, their policies, et cetera. And just as one telling moment in this case, the attorney for the plaintiffs had a website where he played the deposition of the university president, saying things like, you know, he asked, did you have a transition plan? Did you evaluate your policies? Did you come up with a plan for your buildings? And he said, well, we talked about it, but we didn't really think the student union mattered because it's not related to education. Student union, which is the building that was the focus of this, had housed the campus newspaper, the student government, the library, the only cafeteria on campus. But the president and others had decided that you didn't have to comply with respect to those because it wasn't academic. So just be aware that this applies to everything. But the most telling moment to me was the document that was filed with the court, which was the form that was the request for an emergency capital outlay of $8 million. And the reason given was DOJ consultant says so. And the reason I wanted to mention this is you don't want someone else telling you how to spend your money. And that's the danger if you have a review and it leads to an agreement, or you have litigation that leads to the court telling you what to do. Because a court can actually end up ordering you to do things that are more than you might have had to do. If you're ordered to do something, you lose control of your resources, at least in that respect. You don't get to decide when you're going to do something and how and where you're going to spend your money. If $8 million is taken up because a consultant said this is what you have to do, you've lost control of that $8 million. You also end up spending a lot of staff time, resources, and maybe fees for outside consultants or attorneys that you would not necessarily have had to spend. So those are just some simple reasons for trying to avoid these difficulties, or at least de-escalating them if they do occur. Just some examples of private litigation. UC Berkeley was a case that had wide-ranging changes ordered by through a settlement agreement. And the reason I mention this one is that it was filed in '97. There's an agreement that lasts till 2019. So a kid born in 1997 could be through college by the time this agreement is over. Again, it ties you up, and it can be for as much as 21 or 22 years if it's something that goes to litigation. Recent developments. NAD, which is National Association for the Deaf, sued Netflix saying that videos that are streamed online needed to be captioned because it's not effective communication if they aren't. The court didn't say, yes, you absolutely have to caption, but they let the case proceed. They said, yes, if this is true, it's a violation. And then it was settled. So this is an example of what is happening because of the ADA. The Department of Justice filed a brief here and said, yes, that is required. So it's another example of the kind of accommodation that you need to provide, for example, if you're using videos in class or online or on your teaching platforms. E-readers in classrooms. This, I know, drew a lot of attention about 2.5 years ago. Department of Education and Justice wrote to all colleges and universities and later wrote the same thing to K through 12, saying that you can't introduce technology that everyone has to use unless it's accessible to people with disabilities. In this case, some colleges and universities were doing a trial of Kindle for education purposes, and they said, this is how you're going to do it this semester, you're going to use a Kindle. Blind people couldn't use the Kindle. They couldn't navigate the menu. It wasn't accessible to them. So Justice said, this basically said, this violates Section 504 and the ADA. So you have to have accessible technology or equally effective accommodations that allow those students to receive the benefits of the technology. I don't think there is anything that allows that. I think they just threw that in because it's from the regulations. But it's pretty clear, it's very clear what the government expects in this respect. They've also entered into settlement agreements about the Kindle DX that are similar to this with several universities. E-readers at libraries. Justice recently required the City of Sacramento's library, through a settlement agreement, to stop acquiring inaccessible e-readers. This is different from the Kindle issue at a university. This was just something they made available to people if they wanted it. But because they weren't accessible, Justice said they couldn't offer those. This sort of takes this analysis a step farther, and in my opinion, too far. But I just wanted you to be aware of the types of enforcement and that are going on. So now Sacramento will not purchase any technology of this type unless it is accessible. This is some good news. One of the challenges that colleges face sometimes is getting a textbook in digital form for a person who has a learning disability or is blind so that they can use the technology to understand it. And there are digital resources, but they haven't always been available because of copyright laws. The Hathi Trust is one of those resources. The University of Michigan has 10 million digital textbooks in digital form. And this case, and this could really sort of revolutionize making textbooks accessible to students. This case said that the copyright laws do not prevent you from making those available to others. It said that the ADA and the copyright laws require, when you read them together, they allow you to make them accessible to others, and in fact, the ADA requires accessible, digital technology, digital textbooks for those who need them. And what this means now is that universities can digitize their collections and share them with others, and that there is no copyright limitation when they're used for this purpose. So we'll see what happens here. It'll be interesting to follow. It takes a campus. We're back to all y'all now, what all y'all have to do as an institution. I know that some of you have probably had students request or get these types of accommodations. So I want you to just think individually about whether you've had experience with any of this. People may ask for alternate formats. testing in a quiet spot or with breaks, additional time, someone to read to them, someone to take notes, adaptive technology, alternate formats, interpreters. How many of you have had one of these types of requests or have offered or provided or worked with DSS to provide them? Okay, that's almost everybody. That's a very good thing. How many of you felt, I'm going to ask 2 questions. How many of you felt that the process of doing this was unduly burdensome to you? Nobody's watching. The president, don't look. Couple. Okay. How many of you, maybe you didn't really think this, but the thought flashed through your mind that it might not really be necessary? Anybody have any doubts? A few more. Well, this is good. These attitudes are good unless you think you're being watched and aren't being honest. And that's okay too. So it's good to know that you've had experience with this, and I can basically promise that you'll be having even more experience with it. And of course, as we do more electronically, the challenges will become a little bit more difficult. So what does the college have to do? The college, and by this I mean, compliance starts at the top. It starts with somebody really high up, usually the president, saying, we're serious about this and we're going to comply. And that's partly why you're here today. I think you have that message. And the college has a responsibility to decide who's going to do what and make that clear and make the policies and procedures clear. So they have to tell the student, where do you go for services? Put that on your website. You've already done that. It's clear that you go to DSS if you have a request that is going to need their intervention or their action. You need to have a clear grievance process. You have to put notice out to the public, have a good appeals process for grievances. The law requires that you do a self-evaluation of all your policies and programs, and that if you need to make physical changes, you have a transition plan that allows you, that sets out exactly what you're going to do for your facilities. Maybe you did that in 1992 when it had to be done, but if you think about what's changed, and I mean, just look at what's going on campus now with your facilities, people have been moved around, the buildings are changing, the use of the buildings has changed, and then on the program side, you offer so many more programs and courses and types of courses and deliver them in so many more new ways that you may want to think about a do-over of your self-evaluation, or at least updating it. DSS coordinates the academic adjustments, the modifications, et cetera, and then the college sets clear expectations for faculty. If you look in the booklet that you got today in the program, there's a really good guide to faculty responsibilities and who does what. I think it's really well written. It's a great reference. I'm touching on some of these today, but for further study, I highly recommend that you check that out. DSS is the office that's responsible for coordinating, the quiet spot for testing, the distraction-free environment, how much extended time does a person get. They figure out whether a person has a disability. You have the right to ask for the letter that says this person gets accommodations, but whether they have a disability is not up to you as a faculty member. That's a decision that DSS makes based on principles about documentation. And the DSS will keep that confidential. That information is only to be used when it's necessary. And in fact, if you have information about someone's disability, you should not discuss that even with other faculty members unless you have permission from that student. But even like, this person has this learning disability, what are you doing for them in your class? You should not be discussing that unless the person has made it obvious that they want that to be discussed, or are they giving you permission? This is personal information. So DSS keeps up with all of these things. They keep on top of whether the disability has been exacerbated or whether there's some reason that the accommodations might change. And you will be involved with some of the accommodations that are requested. For example, you might be asked to ask if someone in the class wants to be a note taker, because someone might have a disability that makes it difficult for them to take notes. If a person who is deaf has a sign language interpreter, it's very difficult, almost impossible to be looking at the sign language interpreter and taking notes at the same time, for example. People with learning disabilities might need a note taker. So you may be asked to ask if someone wants to take notes for a person. You should avoid saying, you know, we have a person who has this learning disability and it's Jim over here who wants to take notes for him. But you will be asked to try to find a note taker if one is needed. You might be asked if that's how DSS does it. You will have to submit materials. If you want DSS to digitize them or put them in alternate format, you will need to do that. So I think it's 5 weeks is what your brochure says. That's your responsibility as a faculty member to submit your course packets and other materials within a time that allows DSS to put them in an alternate format. And otherwise, you will probably have to do that yourself. And you have to start thinking about creating PowerPoints and video and other means of electronic media. How are you going to make those accessible? It's not academic. This is the one that doesn't necessarily affect learning, but you may encounter some of these issues in the classroom. It used to be that service animals, we thought of service animals as guide dogs for people who are blind. Now a service animal is just a dog, but it can be a dog that does a number of things. You can also have someone with a miniature horse coming into the classroom, and in some cases that is an appropriate accommodation. People sometimes use miniature horses because they live longer than dogs. People who are allergic to dogs aren't necessarily allergic to miniature horses. Some people have religious objections to using dogs as service animals. And miniature horses provide extra stability beyond what a service dog would do because they're stocky and they're bigger. So if someone has an issue with stability or mobility, they may need them. You don't need to decide when it's appropriate, when it's not. One of you, the individual y'all, but all y'all should be coming up with policies about when will they be admitted and when will they not. And emotional support animals of the type here, the white rat and the snake, are not allowed in the classroom. You don't have to have them in the classroom. You can choose to. And good news for you, you don't have to think about these because they're allowed in residence halls and you don't have them. So I want to give you a little good news there. Service dogs aren't necessarily just with blind people. They can do a number of things, and the one I want is this one on the left because it does the laundry. Service animals can retrieve things, and this dog is retrieving from the dryer, I think, for the individual in the wheelchair. They can pick up things that they drop. They can get sodas out of a soda machine. They can provide stability. They can alert someone that a seizure is coming. People with hearing disabilities have hearing alert dogs as well. Pit bulls can be service animals. And the reason I'm saying this is if someone comes into your classroom with an animal and it bothers you for whatever reason, you are not the one to do anything about it. You might want to talk to DSS and get some advice, but don't say, what is this? What is, do you really need this dog? Can't you use a smaller one? You can ask, can it not be a pit bull? You can say, do you need this service animal because of a disability, and what does it do? If somebody says it alerts me to a seizure, don't say, oh, do you have epilepsy, or how does it do that? Justice is very clear about this. It can be problematic. If you have a question about it, don't get into a fight with the individual. Talk to DSS or the legal office. As I mentioned, mini winnies, which is what they call them, miniature horses, also may be allowed. People who use OPDMDs, too bad about that acronym. I usually can't remember it, but I have it on the PowerPoint. These are devices that provide mobility, assist a person with mobility, but weren't necessarily developed for that purpose. A wheelchair and a mobility scooter were developed for that purpose. Segways weren't developed for that. They were developed for recreation, but people with disabilities are using them more and more often. especially veterans. And here are some pictures of someone using them inside and outside. You are to allow those where it's reasonable. And again, this is an all y'all thing. The college needs to have a policy. Will you allow them at graduation? Will you allow them in crowded areas? Will you allow them on the sidewalks, but not in a crowded auditorium, et cetera? And those are the kinds of factors that go into making that decision. This is just thrown in for fun. You don't have to provide Segway parking, but there is a vineyard in California that does, and they say unauthorized vehicles will be drenched in cheap box wine at owner's expense. So you might just want to mention, like, what's your worst microbrewery around here? I don't know. I know you have a number, but we'll be drenched in cheap beer, maybe. Physical accessibility is, the whole movement started with physical access. And I'm just going to use this room as an example, and I might be wrong about it, but I think this building was built quite recently, and I don't know how somebody gets to the stage. There's a lift. Where is it?
They come right out the door behind you.
They go to the door back here?
Yep, and then it comes up here to this level.
Okay. How do they get to that door?
Through this door is the lift, and then down the lift, and then around right out the lift through to you.
Okay. And where's the accessible seating?
It would be up here on the top, you're correct.
Okay, that might be problematic. Just something to look into. There are very clear provisions now, especially after the new standards have been issued, about integrated seating and dispersing it, and it's supposed to be comparable to seating for others. The access to the stage was okay under the old standards. The new standards, which you're not subject to unless you do some alteration generally, require direct access to the stage from the audience if you have it for others. So here, I could just walk up these steps if I was here, or I guess if I was in where the accessible area is, I would go by way of Philadelphia, sort of, in my opinion, and use the lift. And one reason for this is that in colleges and universities, this was one of the big complaints that we got, is, I go to the graduation ceremony, I use a wheelchair, it takes me 10 minutes to get up there on the stage, I'm not with the group, I'm not filing by like everyone else. So integration is a key piece of the ADA, and the standards reflect that. There are strict requirements for new construction and for alterations. And then there's also a requirement that as a whole, people can't be discriminated against by not being able to use the facilities for a certain program. So I know you have some old buildings, and let's assume, I haven't seen them, but let's assume that some of them have some inaccessible office spaces or inaccessible classrooms. It may be necessary to move the classrooms or for you to have office hours in an accessible location. This is the concept of program access to the programs. You probably won't be involved in making decisions like that, but you need to be willing to make the change that's requested, to move if you're asked to. And some instructors don't like to move their classes because they're used to their classroom, it's the one that they use, et cetera, but you may be required to do that. This is just an example of an inaccessible lab. Counters are too high. Another thing you need to do is make sure if there's something accessible that students are using, it stays accessible. There was an effort here. They lowered the counter. Let's give them kudos for that. But then what happened? They put in a panel where the knee space was. They stored things under it, and they put the coffee pot and all the materials on top. So you will be responsible for making sure that doesn't happen in your classroom or your lab. Seating, if there are some places that are accessible and some that aren't, you may need to be sure that the seating is reserved for people who need the accessibility. Then, we've hit on most of these already, but I just sort of wanted to sum up the kinds of responsibilities that you have. Comply with college policies. If you have questions, talk to DSS or legal. Be active in the process, the interactive process of figuring out what accommodations might be needed if they affect space in your classroom or note-taking, et cetera. Ask for assistance, stay involved in the process. If you delay an accommodation, if you say, I'm thinking about it, I haven't decided yet, that can be equated to a denial in certain instances. I've mentioned that you may be asked to hold classes or office hours in an accessible location. You may need to remind other people that areas need to be reserved in that way. One of your big issues now on campus, I know also, is emergency preparedness, and I think probably you're thinking about that as what if we have a shooting or some violent act, but as was mentioned yesterday at one of the sessions, anything can happen. There can be a tornado, a storm, something can spill on the highway, a chemical spill. There may be reasons that you need to evacuate campus or a building, and one of the things you need to think about is how do you get people who can't go down or downstairs or up in a facility like this, how do you get them to an exit or to a safe area? And you may be involved in that as well. You may be asked to direct people to the right place or to make a sweep to be sure everyone is out of the building, et cetera. I've already suggested some of these, but I mentioned earlier that one of y'all can take all y'all out of compliance. Asking those questions that I mentioned, you shouldn't ask. Telling people you can't use a tape recorder, this is my intellectual property and you can't record it. It is a legitimate accommodation if that's what an individual needs. If you say, I don't want an interpreter because there are too many people in this class already, it's too crowded, it's going to be distracting, those are not legitimate reasons to interfere with an accommodation. You do need to get your materials in on time. And if someone asks for a print copy of something that you used in class because of their disability, and DSS says, yes, you should, then you need to supply those copies. And in addition, there is a session about this today, so I'm not going to say much about it, but universal design in learning is a concept that says if you use different modes of presentation, interaction, and evaluation, which can mean physical involvement, mental involvement, emotional, oral, visual, variety of means. You are adapting, you're appealing to various learning styles, and you're especially helping people with disabilities. You're helping people who are not necessarily native English speakers. People who aren't traditional students may also learn better in a way that is different from straight lecture, for example. So this is an educational principle that greatly assists people with disabilities. And this is sort of what I call a faculty-owned accommodation. You don't have to go to DSS and say, I'm thinking of doing this in my class. You may be benefiting people with disabilities, but this is on your own initiative. Providing a course syllabus that sets out clear expectations and what's going to happen is another example of that. And I'm going to do a couple soft slides. Students who come straight from high school grew up with the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. If they had a disability, it was the responsibility of the school to identify them as having one and provide an individualized education plan. They get to college and things are very different. So you may see a student who might be having a problem and you don't know if they're registered with DSS maybe or if they have a disability, but just keep in mind that their struggle might be partly because they have a disability and they're on their own and they're independent, and let's hope they don't have mom or dad with them every day or calling the instructors every day. I know that happens, but it's a whole new environment for them. So it may be appropriate at times to just say, do you know, you seem to be struggling, is there anything I can do? And if it might seem to be related to disability, you can refer them for further discussions with DSS. So just keep in mind that it's a whole new experience for all students, but especially for students with disabilities, there can be more complications. Hostile environment, you've probably heard about this in the context of other laws. It applies under the ADA. Don't single out persons who are receiving accommodations. Don't use derogatory language about them, and don't let others do that because you may be creating a hostile environment. The college has a duty to respond promptly, and you have a duty to take action and or report anything that might create a hostile environment. And retaliation is prohibited. If someone complains, whether it's formal or informal, and you take action based on the fact that they complained, you're retaliating, and that's prohibited discrimination. And People First is a movement that says, put the people first. A person is a person who's blind or a person who is deaf. They're not a deaf person, they're not a wheelchair. And then there are some lists here of words that are preferred over others because of their implications. You don't say the blind, the deaf, or the crippled. And parking is not handicapped. It is accessible, let's hope, if it's required to be. And then I'm assuming that at some point you will have some disability etiquette training. Maintain space, don't lean on a person's wheelchair because that's their space. Don't talk to a person's attendant or a person's interpreter directly, like what does he want or does she understand me? Speak directly to the individual. And don't start helping someone unless you've offered or they've indicated they want assistance. Don't go up and just drag a blind person by the hand to take them somewhere, or just start pushing a wheelchair or helping somebody with their walker unless you ask, is there something can I help you with anything? Because, well, I don't even need to tell you why. So in summary, don't let a request become a problem. Don't let a problem become a complaint become an investigation or a compliance review. Don't let any of these become a lawsuit. If you have a problem, get help, de-escalate it. Don't think that it's necessarily something you have to solve right then and there. Find somebody who knows more about it. Don't leave a student hanging in the wind about accommodations. Know who to go to, and this is something that the college is responsible for telling you, and alert DSS if there are concerns. We talked about success. I don't know if any of you are Downton Abbey fans, but I am. And there was a great line the other night. The Dowager Countess in Britain was visited by an American relative who's very showy and flashy and wealthier than they, it turns out. And her comment was about Shirley MacLaine, the person who's played by Shirley MacLaine. The Dowager Countess said, "Nothing succeeds like excess," which I thought was a great line and made me think nothing succeeds like access in our line of work. Here is, I mentioned earlier, problems with accessing stages and graduation. This is the future, and I hope it's now, and it's part of what the new regulations will bring about. Here is a student going up on the stage in the same way as everyone else, on an equal level with the dignitaries as everyone else has been, and she uses a wheelchair, and probably because of support of faculty members like you and the college as a whole, she has, in her mind, achieved the success that she expected. And I just want to encourage all of you to keep that goal in mind as you work with students and with others at your college going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. A couple logistical things. The next thing that we have on the program is a short break. All of you should have received one of these when you walked in. When we leave this space, you'll notice that the breakout sessions begin at 10:45. They will run till 11:45. Then lunch will be set up outside the same place that breakfast was from 11:45 until 12:30. From 12:30 to 1:30, you will attend your second session, and then we will be back here together at 1:45. Now, to guide you in getting to your sessions, there are signs outside. In the program, you have the full titles and descriptions and presenters for all of the sessions. When you signed in, there were abbreviated titles that were not necessarily the same. So, there are signs outside that have the abbreviated titles and locations, and all of the full titles and locations are on the monitors, so we have lots of signs that will direct you, just so that you know what the spaces are. Nanette Clatterbuck will be doing accommodating learning styles in here. This is the Tomatis Auditorium. The Instructive and Assistive Technology session by Jeff Sykes and Megan Willey is in the sessions area, which is right outside of this auditorium. Lenny Scott Weber from Steelcase will be doing the Accessible Learning Spaces session in the Great Hall, out where the tables were set up. And the last two sessions, Disability Accommodations with Ron Ralia and Ann Sherman, and our Universal Design session by Ann Alexander and Cheryl Couts, are in conference rooms 3104 and 3105. If you go out back to where the food tables were and turn left, there are signs, the conference rooms are in the back. And for those of you attending the leadership session, it will be in the what's called the pre-function space, which is where the tables are set up outside of rooms 3104 and 3105. There are restrooms in the sessions area. There are also restrooms in the back hallway near the conference rooms. And there's coffee outside. Thank you.